It's time for us to check back in with Sidney Saylor Farr and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. Special June days and July a delight. In June, we would begin to harvest produce from our garden. I will never forget the satisfaction of eating tender new beans, new potatoes, tomatoes, and cucumbers, sweet corn, a pan of hot golden cornbread, and cold milk or iced tea. Admittedly, if we had had a cold spring, we might not see tomatoes and green beans until July, but they will always be associated in my mind as June foods. There are other special days in June, days that bring back memories of when I was a child. My mother was born on June 22nd, 1909 in Leslie County, Kentucky on Laurel Branch. Dad's birthday was in the summertime too, August 12th, 1911. She and Dad were married in June 1930. The middle brother, Fred, was born June 16th, 1943. Other days in June were also memorable. Many people universally hold Father's Day dear. My husband Grant was born June 19, 1947. When Grant and I married, my son Bruce suddenly had 3 presents to buy on Father's Day. One for his dad, one for Grant, and another for Grant's birthday, which often coincided with Father's Day. I always loved the month of July. It meant pure summer. Generous sunshine, wondrous green leaves and grass. Perhaps because it is Independence Month, it makes me think of the phrase, July Jubilee. In July especially, the landscape and sounds of the forest, the look of the moon at night, the slant of light during the day, and the falling rain all give me a deeper perception, a keener awareness of what the world has to offer. When we have a cold, wet spring, it is sheer delight to soak up July's warmth. Blackberries. I have mixed feelings about berry picking in June and July. On the one hand, I enjoy eating the ripe berries, but on the other hand, they have to be picked first. This was Chiggerfest time, and also the time for wood ticks, which would become badgering pest if we were not careful. And we also had to watch out for snakes. Granny Brock would carry a stout stick and walk ahead of us children, beating the weeds and making as much noise as she could to scare the snakes away. It was scary to be standing still while she did this and then suddenly see the tall grass start swaying ahead of us or around the side of the hill. Something was moving through it. It might just have been a rabbit or other small creature, but we were convinced it was a snake Granny had scared into running away. I tried to be brave as I poked my hands into the green matted briars to grab those perfect plump berries. Yet I spent so much time looking out for snakes, Granny could pick 2 buckets for every one of mine. The blue blackberries often tempted us at first, but eating a few would usually sate our appetites. Granny Brock or Mama would make the blackberries into a hot cobbler for supper and would use them to make jam for future biscuits. After feasting on fried chicken, simmered green beans, tomatoes, and golden cornbread, blackberry cobbler made a perfect finish to our July supper. When huckleberries ripened, it was usually the men and bigger boys who went to pick them. Huckleberries grew on the tops of hills and ridges, and they were difficult to find and pick. Huckleberry picking was considered men's work. One day, however, Dad took me with him to pick huckleberries. I cannot quite remember what made him decide to let me join him, but I do remember how excited I felt and how I bragged to Della. She wanted to go with us, but Dad said no, it was too rough a trip for her. Dad and I climbed up the hillside and worked our way around the ridge until we found a growth of huckleberry bushes. I was not afraid of snakes or anything else because I knew Dad would not let anything hurt me. We started picking and the sun climbed higher and higher in the sky. By the time it was directly overhead, I was tired, hungry, and thirsty. Dad found a little cleared space in a sheltered area and built a small fire. He cut 3 or 4 limbs from a bush and sharpened the ends. Then he took a piece of lean bacon and a piece of cornbread out of his hunting pouch. He cut small chunks of bacon and speared them onto the sticks. We held these over the fire until the meat was cooked. A chunk of bacon broiled over a fire and eaten with cornbread, the hot grease soaking into the bread, made a tasty meal there on top of that hill. One July day, Dad, my sister Della, and I were hoeing corn. The field we had planted was not far from a little country store. Dad said he would get us something to eat at the store. At noon, he bought Viennese sausages. Only years later did I learn about a city in Austria named Vienna. A can of sardines and saltines. He got each of us a bottle of cold pop to drink, and we carried our lunch back to the edge of the cornfield to eat. Dad ate the sardines, but Della and I preferred the sausages. Nothing in this world has ever tasted any better to me than those Vienna sausages, crackers, and orange pop. That store was my haven. Its nooks and crannies became as familiar to me as my mother's kitchen. We kids earned spending money by gathering bottles to return for a deposit, 5 cents per bottle. Candy was 5 cents a bar, bubble gum a penny apiece. Pencils also sold for a penny each, while Blue Horse writing tablets cost a nickel. I loved paper and pencils. Recently, some out-of-state friends came for a visit. We drove from Berea, several miles out into the country, to the Drip Rock Fire Tower. Stopping at a country store along the way, I bought an orange pop and a can of Vienna sausages, hoping to recreate that delicious long-ago lunch in our cornfield. But they tasted nothing like what I ate in the cornfield that July day. I was disappointed. When I'm in pain or feel the world is closing in on me, just one thing will make me feel better: to cook food like Mama did when we lived on Stony Fork. Green beans, fried corn, biscuits, fried chicken and gravy, mashed potatoes, baked ham, homemade pickles, soup beans with ham. These are foods I take out and savor in my memory, even if I'm not prepared to cook foods like that for my next meal. Usually, though, when I am feeling low, I wind up cooking at least one dish like my mother. Dog Days of Summer. The Dog Days of Summer runs from July until mid-August, when the dog star rises and sets with the sun. The dictionary definition is that dog days are the stifling hot days of summer. It is a season of mold, mildew, and the pestilence of stagnant water. Mama and Granny Brock warned us about dog days. We children were not to wade in the creeks because the stagnant water would make fall sores on our legs. I remember how impossible it was to stay out of the creek during the torrid days of summer, when every bug bite and scratch turned into a sore. There would be 4 or 5 sores on our legs and arms during the late summer until cooler weather set in. We were told that dogs went mad during the dog days, so we were terrified of any strange dog that happened to wander our way. The rumor that a possibly mad dog was spotted in the neighborhood was enough to send us inside, locking the doors and vigilantly guarding the windows. We were also told that snakes went blind during dog days, striking out savagely at anything that moved. During dog days, in addition to hot, sultry days, there were days of rain. I thought of rainy days as days of freedom from the sweat bees, briars, and the duty of hoeing corn in the hot sunshine. I would take a book to the corn crib or barn where I could spend hours in another world, reading and being comforted by the sound of rain on the roof. To this day, when it rains, I feel an urge to snuggle up in a dry place with a good book. Chapter 9, Transition to Harvest. Sometimes it almost seems a burden to realize the promise of summer when red and white clover blooms and green corn unfurls, when butterflies come in clouds of color and misty rain washes the earth. Always in early spring, Dad began clearing off new ground in preparation for a field of corn. He liked to plant a new field every year along with the old ones. We planted corn as early as possible, and by the middle of May, if the weather was good, it was ready for the first hoeing. When the rows of corn were shoulder high, Mama would stick in half-runner beans, which would grow up and twine around the cornstalk. This kept the beans off the ground and made picking them easier. The beans never hurt the corn. Dad said that corn must be hoed 3 times, the third and last time called laying it by. If it was a good growing season, the corn would be laid by before the 4th of July. In fact, it was a matter of pride for every household to have their corn laid by before the 4th. When I was a child, we might have to chop the weeds from between the rows of corn after laying it by, but we'd never have to hoe it again that season. When green ears appeared on the stalks, we could hardly wait for the corn to mature so we could eat it in a variety of ways. Jar flies. When I was young, every summer I would hear the queer metallic whir of the jar fly in the mountains while waves of heat shimmered from the fields and pastures. Usually jar flies start their hollering in the summer around the last days of June. It was a signal that the plowing and hoeing of corn could be laid by. There used to be a lot more of them, Granny Brock said. They hollered so loud people couldn't hear the cowbells. Occasionally I would hear the high-pitched cry of a 17-year-old locust or a cicada from a distant treetop. I was fascinated with the story of the 17-year locust, how they lay dormant for 17 years, then move in clouds, thousands and thousands of them, devouring all the fruit, berries, and garden produce in their path. I read about them in the Farmer's Almanac, and I asked Mama to tell me everything she had ever heard about them. I sometimes found empty shells of these insects beneath the apple trees, with a split down the backs, the sign of their freedom. I thought of all the years that they lay dormant, waiting for their summer of release. One day when we heard the locust's shrill cry, I said to Mama, "They must be cries of victory." Predictions of the weather. Of course, we had all sorts of sayings about the weather. Early mornings in the mountains, tendrils of fog would often curl their way into the sky from the hilltops. When the mist rose a certain way, it was believed to be a sure sign of rain. The old mountain saying, "Fog on the hills bring water to the mills," was often repeated. There's an old rhyme about St. Swithin's Day, July 15th. If it rains on St. Swithin's Day, it will rain for the next 40 days. If it is fair on July 15th, it will be fair for 40 days. Another saying was rain before 7, quit before 11. There was also an old Indian saying, cloudy all around, pouring down in the middle. I was taught to believe in signs, sayings, and predictions, and when it came to the weather, I believed it all. Heritage seeds. Dead leaves, stems of dry plants, and yellow and brown grass all told of cycles and seasons. I am glad when the time of mold, mildew, and stagnant water has passed, even if I hold a thread of regret that summer's promise is almost over. I look forward to gathering and storing in preparation for the winter months. Each season of the year brings blessings and gifts. I always long to hold on to the crisp, refreshing air of early fall, the white morning mist, and the golden dust of fall evenings. I wish I could hoard those days in a treasure chest so that in the dead of winter I could take them out and enjoy a day of sunshine and blue skies. Part of the melancholy we feel in autumn is knowing that summer has gone, and when autumn ends, then come the gray days and cold rain of November and December. My mother always saved seed from each year's crop to plant the next year. She would plant some seed hills to let the beans dry on the plant and save them for seed. She grew greasy-back beans, which we loved. They grew 6 or more beans to a pod. Mama kept her own seed from year to year from the tender plants and never took a chance on store-bought seed because, as she said, they might have tough seed mixed in with the tender seed. Mama and Dad raised bushels of potatoes and onions to store. They had turnips and mustard greens and pumpkins and cushaws ready just after the first frost. And sometime around the middle of the growing season, Mama would plant several rows of late beans. I love green fall beans when they first come out of the kettle, especially if they've been seasoned with a piece of well-cured, dried out properly, and aged fatback. But they are even better when they have been warmed over a time or two until the cooking water gets good and thick. If you pour some of that thick pot liquor over a chunk of cornbread and let it soak in a bit, you have a wonderful accompaniment to the beans. These late beans Mama simply called fall beans. She kept the seed for them alive year after year. I depended on Mama to save seed for me. Mama would also save a few of the biggest, most perfect tomatoes. When they were fully ripe, she scraped out the seed, which she dried in the sun and then stored in a jar until early spring. She planted the tomato seed in a galvanized wash tub, which could easily be covered during frosty nights, and set out the transplants when the ground got warm. Every year we would find tomatoes growing in the places where a tomato had rotted or tomato peel and seeds had been dumped. These we called tomatoes, and it was incredible how strong and vigorous the plants were and how the small round tomatoes would be bursting with flavor. Today at the farmer's market I buy cherry tomatoes, but they never taste as good as the sweet, sound flesh of the tomatoes in our garden, and the skins of the cherry tomatoes are tougher. Canned tomatoes were a beautiful sight on the pantry shelves, but they took a lot of peeling, coring, seeding, cooking, stirring, sterilizing, and processing. It is much easier to freeze tomatoes, but frozen tomatoes are watery by comparison with canned, and they are not as tasty or versatile. However, when we got electricity on Stony Fork and purchased a freezer, I began freezing most of my tomatoes. I like having tomatoes for soups and ketchup and juice in the winter, and the steam that's generated from making ketchup and juice is always more welcome in the house at that time of the year than it is in the summer. I am glad that there are gardeners today who continue to preserve specimens and seeds of many of the old plants our forebears loved. Delphiniums strong enough to stand alone, dianthus that smell of cloves, and tomatoes that taste like tomatoes. Tomatoes are probably growing in somebody's garden or a field, even as I write. The last few years when I've bought half-runner beans, I have been disappointed with how tough they are. They must have been from altered seed, not heritage seed, like Mama's. Rachel Saylor, 1909 to 1986. My mother died in 1986 at 77 years of age. She never remarried after Dad died and cherished memories of him all of her life. For a long while she suffered with congestive heart disease, but the day she died was one of the best days she had had in years. Brother James said she cooked a good dinner that Sunday. She was cheerful, laughing, and talking with him. She told him she would like to go to church that night. James drove her to the Little Holiness Church on Stony Fork, which they attended when they were able. During the service, Mama gave her testimony and asked for special prayers for her children. When James and Mama got back home, she began having an attack of shortness of breath. Immediately, James took her to the kitchen door near where the car was parked. At the door, she put her hands on the door frame and wouldn't go outside. James asked her if she wanted to go to the hospital. She shook her head no. He half carried her to the bedroom and put a blanket over her. He called Della, who lived only a few doors up from them. Della came immediately, and Mama died in her arms. When James called me to tell me what had happened, I said, "I'm glad she won't suffer anymore." I felt at peace about her transition. Brother James' green thumb. My brothers Fred and Leroy both married young, but James did not marry until he was older, and then after the birth of a daughter, got a divorce. When he was 20, James was diagnosed with juvenile diabetes. Every day thereafter, he had to inject himself with insulin. He did a poor job of controlling his sugar, and by the time he was in his late 30s, he had eye damage. This forced him to give up his job as a county school bus driver, and it was almost impossible for him to find another job. His health kept failing, he developed heart trouble, and suffered a series of prostate infections. James lived with Mama and helped care for her until her death. She took care of him when he had bad spells, and he did the same for her. Eventually, he was entitled to receive Social Security payments. After Mama's death in 1986, James lived alone. He could not see well enough to drive and was dependent on others to take him where he needed to go. Mostly, he just stayed home alone. At first, he continued to live in the little house Mama had left him, but the mortgage payments got to be more than he could handle. Eventually, James sold the house and was able to move into a government-subsidized high-rise apartment complex near Pineville, Kentucky. His apartment was tiny, consisting of a galley kitchen, a living room, a bedroom, and a bathroom. There were sliding glass doors in the living room and bedroom. Mama had a green thumb. Anything she stuck in the ground grew vigorously in her care. When James moved into the apartment, he brought with him some of Mama's houseplants. He took delight in and cared for the plants just as she had. Every plant stayed healthy and proliferated. James and I both took after Mama when it came to plants. I grow plants and trees in every room of my house. In my kitchen window, I have pots of geraniums and petunias, which are in full bloom as I write. During the recent snow and ice, I would stand and look at the pink and white petunias and the red geraniums and marvel at the fresh beauty of the delicate flowers. I love each plant, and I'm glad to have them in my home. I started taking James any extra plants I had on hand. Other women in our extended family would bring their puny sick plants to him, and invariably James would coax them back to health. Sometimes their owners would take them back home, but every once in a while they would tell James to keep the plants. Soon his apartment was crowded with plants. The plants were his family, his children. He loved each one and spent many hours working with them. People who visited him for the first time were always surprised when they came into his living room because it looked like a greenhouse. I was proud that James had found a love for trees and plants and kept busy caring for and loving them. Lord knows he had little else. He could not read or watch much television because of his eyesight. He was not able to go places and do things physically, but he kept his mental health. Meanwhile, I kept adding to his collection. Anytime I found a particular type of plant that James did not have, I got it for him. Other family members would smile indulgently at James and all his plants and said they could never get plants to grow that way. James just grinned at them. He would not even try to verbalize his love and commitment to his plants and trees. I once gave him a deep pink hibiscus that had 8 to 10 blooms at a time all summer long on my front steps. I really did not have a good place to keep it over the winter, so I offered it to James, and he readily accepted it. Several weeks later, in a phone conversation, he told me all the leaves were falling off the hibiscus. I reassured him as best I could, suggesting that the climate change may have been a shock. The next time we talked, he told me sadly that he thought the plant was going to die. I said rather flippantly that he should start talking to it. He should tell it to live and bloom, or he would throw it out in the trash can. James had never heard about talking to plants, and I know he thought it was a weird suggestion. A couple of weeks later, I asked if the hibiscus plant had died. He was silent for a moment and then said, "I reckon I've been talking to it, telling it what you said." "Can you tell it made any difference? It put out green shoots, and now it's full of buds." When still in his 50s, James moved like a much older man. He talked about his impending death. His dearest wish was that people take his plants and care for them as he had. When Brother James died in 2001, in a way, his going was a relief to us. He had suffered so much and lived such a lonely life for so many years. He had told me on several occasions of his wish to die. He really had no quality of life because of his illness and handicaps. My youngest sister, Sharon Rose, took most of his plants home to Indianapolis with her after the funeral. The remainder, his former wife shared with her friends. I used to call James every Sunday. I miss those talks, but I believe that he is at peace and happy to be home with the family members who left before him. Another fascinating look into the life of Sidney Saylor Farr. I really enjoyed this part of the book. I've enjoyed all of it so far, though. I especially liked at the beginning when she's talking about the months of June and July, kind of talking about what they meant to her living when she grew up in the mountains of Appalachia. I feel the same way. They're magical months, both of them. I'm crazy about all of the months of Appalachia, all the months living here in Appalachia, because each season has so many different things to offer. But I loved some of the same things that she talked about. I love in July, feeling the hot sun beat down on my shoulders. I love the sound of jar flies. That's such a comforting sound for me. I can't walk outside without hearing them during the summer, so I love that in June and July. All that wonderful eating, Matt and I both agree that that's the best eating of the year, when you can eat straight out of the garden. You know, maybe have some fried corn, some squash, some fresh tomatoes, some cucumbers, and a cake of cornbread. That's all you need to have a feast. So I really enjoyed that part. And then also that time of the year she talked about was the blackberry picking. I love to pick blackberries. Now, I'm not afraid of snakes. That part don't bother me, because I know once they see you, they skedaddle, they go on. We do have copperheads and rattlesnakes here that you have to watch out for and keep an eye out for, but they don't bother me. The worst thing about blackberry picking to me is, like she mentioned, the chiggers, but I get chiggers walking through the yard, so I don't have to go blackberry picking to get chiggers. But it would just be the briars. I get in a hurry and I'm reaching in this briar and under here, and my fingers get poked, so that would be the part that I don't like. When I was growing up, Granny was like Sidney Saylor Farr in her Granny Brock. She was terrified of snakes in the blackberry patch. And she would wear these, she'd put on some of Pap's pants and tuck her pants into her boots and wear one of his long sleeve shirts and wear a hat and take a hoe with her. And she'd use the hoe to push back the briars, and she wasn't really brave enough to kill a snake if she seen it. If she seen one, she'd just move on to another place or go get somebody to try to get them to go back with her and scare it off. But I love that and Sidney Saylor Farr was kind of talking like that. All those things you didn't like, it was worth doing all that just to get that wonderful berry so that you could make jelly with it, make jam, make cobblers with it. So it was the same way for Granny. She was afraid of the snakes, but there was nothing going to deter her from getting the berry so that she could take them home and eat them and fix them for her family. So I really enjoyed that part. I loved the memory of her and her father picking huckleberries. That had to be such a precious time for her, that he asked her to go with him, and there they are out in the woods on the mountain and eating the bacon and the cornbread over the fire. That's such a lovely memory, that bonding time with them. Really special. And the one with him and her and Della at the field there, getting to go to the little country store and get them something to eat. Those kind of foods, even if it is sardines and Vienna, people call them different things, Vienna sausages, Viennese sausages, you hear some people say, and crackers, they do seem to just taste so good if you're outside. I've always said, a bologna sandwich tastes good as long as you're eating it outside. It makes it even more special. I think bologna sandwich is pretty good inside too, but when you're outside, it just makes food taste so much better. I liked sardines when I was little. I still like them. Pap liked them, and I think that was why I liked them. And I don't remember Granny or Steve or nobody else eating them, but Pap would eat them and I would eat them with crackers. I still like them. But Paul did not only did he not like them, they made him sick. So I remember one summer day, June and July, like Sidney was talking about, we were out of school and I was going to eat sardines for my dinner, sardines and crackers. And Paul pitched a little fit and didn't want me to eat them in the house because they made him sick. I'm 4 years older than Paul, so he was younger, he was little. But Granny said, she just didn't want to hear any fussing. Tipper, go outside and eat them, sit on the steps and eat your dinner. So I did. I went out there. I tell this on Paul all the time. It's funny. So I went out there and sat on the steps and eat my sardines and crackers like Granny told me to. And Paul, the little rat, he looked out the window and watched me, and then he got sick and he threw up. So he didn't like it, but he couldn't resist watching me eat those, what he thought was really nasty. He didn't like them. But all those memories of food that Sidney shared, whether it was the sardines, like for me, I relate those to Pap, and I liked them because he did, and that's why I tried them. And then all those comforting summertime foods. It's amazing how we, as humans, food like that you grow up with, it don't just feed you, it nourishes your body, but it also nourishes your soul. I wrote about that today on The Blind Pig and the Acorn, so I'll link to that so you could go go read it if you want to. But it's an amazing thing how food gets tied into our who we are. Even food, like in a situation where maybe it's not what you want to eat. Maybe there's not much to eat and you're kind of poor and that's what you have to eat. But years later, you still look back, you still crave that same food. It kind of becomes part of who you are. So I've always found that was very fascinating thing. And I think on my blog today, people even said there have been a lot of studies, like, you know, scientists and people like that had really studied that, how we become connected to our food like that. I thought, I've liked everything that Sidney says, but I especially liked that part in this one that jumped out at me is when she's talking about those 17-year cicadas. You've probably heard of those or maybe heard them yourself. I have. We've been lucky right here where I live. I think in the last, was it this year or last year, was the year that they would emerge, that they were going to emerge, and they did. But I'm lucky right here where I live in Wilson Holler, they don't show up in large numbers, so they don't damage a lot of things. I hope they never do. But I remember one time, I guess 17 years ago, when that had happened, and it was at church over in Martins Creek, and they were just everywhere. You could just see them. They were everywhere. But anyway, I love that part where she said when she's talking about seeing the little husk that they come out of, and then talking about the sound that they make to her mother. She told her mother she guessed that was cries of victory. Well, you think of that. I mean, it's just really powerful somehow to me that they've been waiting for 17 years and then they emerged. And I thought, yeah, that is. I will never hear them again that I don't think of that, cries of victory. That was really, really got me. I love the part about her mother planting the tomatoes in the galvanized tub. Today, I have a greenhouse, and I'm so picky about how I plant everything. And there, her mother grew wonderful tomatoes for him, and she just started them in a tub and then covered them up at night. Reminds me of Pap told me that his mother Marie, my Mama Marie, that's how she would start hers in something like that. But a lot of times, if they lived somewhere, because in those days they had those high porches, where the sun kind of shone in under the porch, where there's plenty of sunlight, like in the edge of she would plant them right in the edge under the porch, so they were protected from frost and things like that, but the sunshine still shone in there. So I liked that part. I go to such trouble, and then it makes you wonder, should you just plant them all in a big tub and put them outside, not even worry about the greenhouse, and then cover them up when there's a risk of frost. I liked that. I loved when she's talking about the flowers. Flowers in the same way of food. If you live around people that love flowers, they kind of connect with you like that. I love all those that she mentioned, but my favorite was dianthus. I have some dianthus growing outside, and it has the loveliest smell. I really love it. Cloves, it does smell like cloves, and I love it because Granny grew it. I love that, so it reminds me of that. But it reminds me of all the years I've lived here that I grew it. And Corey and Katie really like it, especially Katie. That's her favorite flower. And then I love it because it reminds me of my Uncle Henry. Uncle Henry is someone who loved flowers too. He loved flowering bushes like azaleas and things like that, but he also loves flowers, all kinds of anything that grows. He really loved. When he was able, really loved growing things. I think that's part of where I get my love. He influenced me with that, with all the flowers and things. It just tickled him, and he loved dianthus, so I liked that part. And then the last part about James, that's just really heartbreaking and sad that his health deteriorated, and good that he could stay with her mother until she passed away, and that they kind of had each other, but really sad there at the end that he was by himself. I'm glad he had those plants, but I feel sorry for him. I wish he'd had some human contact too. But Sidney kind of teasing, telling him that he should talk to the plant, the hibiscus, which he did, and then it lived, reminded me of a wonderful lady was my boss one time when I worked at the college, and she'd tell me that you got to talk to plants. She was telling me that one year. She had a porch. Mostly, she grew a few flowers, but she didn't grow a garden like I do. But she had a porch that she put ferns on every year, and she was really telling us, laughing, going on, but about how beautiful her ferns were that year, that they were just beautiful. And she said she knew the reason why, and I said, well, why is your ferns so pretty this year? She said, because I talked to them. And I said, I was just like, kind of rolling my eyes, because I could tell she was teasing, but she said, I talk to them all the time. That's what you've got to do, Tipper. If you want pretty ferns, you've got to talk to them. I said, okay. And I said, well, did they talk back to you? And she said, they do. She said, of course, she was just being funny, but she said, when I walk by on the porch, they reach out their little fronds and they say, Dottie, Dottie, Dottie. So she said they love me because they know I take care of them. So that part reminded me of Dottie and her talking to her ferns and swearing that it worked, One other thing I want to mention is not really about this part. It's about the part of the book that we read last week, if you heard it. So you remember when Sidney and her mother were in the bed, they went to bed that night and they started hearing that knocking sound. And they tried to be quiet and that didn't work. And then the mother hit the floor with her shoe and that didn't work. And then they tried to talk really loud and scare off whatever it was. Anyway, really interesting part of the book. But John, a viewer named John, he left a very interesting comment that I wanted to share. So he commented on that video and he said that knocking sounded a whole lot like the tattooing from Alex Stewart. So if you've not listened to the Alex Stewart readings that I did, basically in it, that was a joke people played on each other and they called it tattooing. They attached a string to the house somewhere on the outside of the house and then stretched it out across to something else, and then they would tap or run their hands on that string and it caused this knocking sound. And in Alex Stewart, they were using it to pull jokes, pull pranks on people, and then even to run someone off, to make them think, a renter think that the house was haunted, so they would move out because they weren't paying their rent. But I'm so grateful that John mentioned that. Thank you, John, because I would have never even connected that. But I was like, you're right. That knocking sounds exactly like the tattooing from the Alex Stewart book. So I wanted to share that with everyone. Please leave a comment and let me know what jumped out at you from this part of the book. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, I hope you'll drop back by next Friday because we've got to see what happens next to Sidney Saylor Farr.